You're 12 years old and you have 3 wishes. Not the kind that come from a lamp, the kind that comes from a gray plastic cartridge that plugs into the bottom of your Nintendo games before you slide the whole thing into your console. The kind you type in, letter by letter, from a booklet that came in the box. All A's. PIGPOG, XXIOPO. You have no idea what they mean. You don't need to. You just know that when you press start, something is different. Mario has 30 lives. The Hammer Brothers throw hammers forever. Link starts the game with everything he'll ever need. For a moment, you feel like you've reached behind the screen and changed something that wasn't supposed to be changed. Like you found a door in a wall that was supposed to be solid. Like the rules of the world turn out to be more like suggestions. Join us for the story of the device that cost $50, took on the most powerful company in gaming, and won on today's trip down memory card lane. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I hope these words find you well. Hello, and welcome to the 305th episode of our video game history podcast, A Trip Down Memory Card Lane. Each week, we'll tell you one story relevant to the current week in gaming history. It can be about a game or the people who have created it. It can be about a console or the technology that brought it to life. We often talk about the companies that bring it all together, making our hobby video games a reality. We'll tell you each story. We hope to teach you something new about the topic, what it took from the world as its inspiration, or what to get back to the world as its legacy. Today, we are looking back at the Game Genie, the cheat device that Codemasters built without permission, that Galoob distributed over Nintendo's strenuous objections, and that a federal court ultimately ruled players had every right to use. It's a story about a cold shoulder at a trade show, a chip that wasn't supposed to be cracked, and a lawsuit that settled something incredibly important about what it means to own a game. I'm David Casson, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, who, I have no doubt, would have typed every code in that booklet in order on day one just to see what they all did. He's my brother, Rob Casson. Rob, infinite lives. Responsible use of technology or the first sign that the system can be taken advantage of?
Dave, why not all of them?
Let me ask you this. Do you cheat in games?
Yes and no.
Okay.
So I will play a game as it's intended, as
Okay.
long as if it's a game with a story, I tend to beat them before I do any cheats. If it's like one of our building games, I try my best to get all the way up to a certain point, and then when we restart and restart and restart and restart and restart and restart, I get tired of it and cheat because I've been through this 18 times. Why do I need to do the stupid stuff again? So yes and no. I'm willing to give a game a good college try, but sometimes you get tired of playing it vanilla and you want to make it different.
Well, to add on to that, because it was similar to how I was going to elaborate on the subject, our time is valuable. like,
Yes.
like when we were young and didn't have responsibilities, like spending hours to, build up a wood stockpile in a game was just fine. Now it's not at all an efficient use of our time. Not in the slightest. And so I'm with you. Like when it comes to cheat codes, I cheat. Not multiplayer games, obviously. We're not into that at all. But single player games all the time. My retro games, absolutely. My normal games, I played uh, trading card store game TCG store simulator recently, and the leveling up system was so bad. So I found like a cheat engine that up you could change the experience multiplier. So I upped it by 10, and finally it didn't take me forever to unlock everything. I don't have forever to put into a game. Um,
See, you said TCG Card Shop Simulator. That's the one of the ones that I didn't do any kind of boosts in. So
I
all
did.
the only thing I did make it so you could open cards faster.
Nice.
But that's it. Literally it. Other than that, did it the good old fashioned way.
Nah. If it's, and we're going to talk a lot about this today because it is what the there's a lot of legal stuff related to this topic, and so we're going to be covering the legal case, a very important legal case around the Game Genie. But the whole thing is about playing a game the way you want to play it. And as far as I'm concerned, if I purchased a game and it's a single player game and it's not hurting anyone else, I should be able to play it however I want. If I don't want to wait to level up, I'm not going to wait to level up. I don't know why. Again, it's not hurting anyone else. Who cares?
Yeah,
So,
if it doesn't affect anyone else's gameplay who does not consent to the cheats being in there, I see no issue. Um, Multiplayer games with like randoms, out of the question. Don't do it.
oh yeah, no, not at
But
all.
solo games or games with friends, all friends are in agreement. Abs freaking lootly, man, all day.
I agree. I completely agree. You should be able to play a video game however you want to play it. No questions asked. All right, well, we're gonna cover Codemasters again. We are gonna cover the Game Genie, and then we're going to spend a lot of time on the legal side of the Game Genie because it is a very important case in video game legalese, is a good way to put it. But before we get there, we have some other things that occurred during this week in gaming history. So, Rob, why don't you take a few moments and share those with our listeners?
All right. Well, we start this week on June 28th, 1991, when Final Fantasy Adventure was released for the Game Boy in North America, developed and published by Square. It wasn't quite a Final Fantasy game, and it wasn't quite an action RPG. It was something in between, a handheld experiment that borrowed the Final Fantasy name for marketing purposes while quietly laying the groundwork for an entirely separate franchise. That experiment eventually became the Mana series, and Final Fantasy Adventure became known retroactively as Sword of Mana. Not a bad legacy for a game that started as a spin off nobody was sure what to call.
The Mana series is fantastic, beautiful. I started it with the Super Nintendo version, second in the series, if I'm not mistaken, The Secret of Mana. Although there might be more than one Game Boy title, I'm not entirely sure. I'm probably wrong on that.
I feel like there was one for PlayStation or PlayStation 2. No, it had to have been PlayStation.
No, there was Legend, I think, of Mana.
Yes, that's the one that I was familiar with because you had that, and then when you moved off, it got left at home, and I played it, and I was like, interesting. But I
I
think we might have
also
played it together too.
I also had two copies of Dawn of Mana, which
No,
is
no,
the
no, nope,
the
wouldn't have been that
DS
one.
one. No, my college roommate and I both owned it, and somehow I ended up with both copies.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah, no, I've never
S-
only ever played Legends.
So we had the DS one. Anyways, it's a fantastic. If you're into RPGs, it's one of the, in my opinion, one of the better series out there. That's not Final Fantasy, and you should give it a try.
Next up, on July 1st, 1991, the original Duke Nukem was released for PC, developed and published by Apogee Software. This was long before Duke became the sunglasses wearing, one liner delivering action hero most people remember. This was a side scrolling platformer starring a guy in a red shirt, and it launched through Apogee's shareware model. The first episode free, and the rest by mail order. The character would eventually find his way into a very different kind of game and into a court case that had more than a little to do with the legal territory we're covering today.
Yes, indeed, Duke Nukem, long and troubled series. We've done an episode on Duke Nukem 3D in the beginning. We've also done an episode on Duke Nukem Forever. That was a lot of fun learning why that game took, I think, 14 years to develop. But it all started here with the original Duke Nukem, which has none of what Duke Nukem is known for, other than Duke Nukem himself, realistically. So completely different beginnings, for sure.
Absolutely. So go check it out if you want to know more.
Please do.
Also on June 28th, 9 years after the release of Final Fantasy Adventure in 2000, Diablo 2 was released for PC, developed by Blizzard North and published by Blizzard Entertainment. If the original Diablo invented the template for the action RPG dungeon crawler, Diablo 2 perfected it, adding an act structure, a deeper loot system, and an online multiplayer experience through Battle.net that kept players grinding for years. It sold over 4 million copies in its first year and remains one of the most influential PC games ever made. Even today, people are still playing it.
We played it.
Damn straight we played it.
We sure did. We played through the first one and then we played through the second one
Yeah.
and
And
had a
then
lot of
little
fun
of the third
doing
one.
it. Yeah, a little of the third one. So had a lot of fun doing it. Diablo 2 still, in my opinion, golden standard for the action RPG genre. I don't think that they've done it better since then. That's just my opinion. There are people that probably like Diablo 3. I don't know anyone that likes Diablo 4. Sorry,
I
Blizzard.
never played it, so I can't really speak to it.
Sorry. But there was the peak of the Diablo series. Check it out.
Indeed, check it out. Next up, on July 2nd, 2009, Trine was released for PC, developed by Frozen Byte and published by Strategy First. A physics based puzzle platformer set in a fairy tale world, Trine let players switch between three characters: a wizard, a knight, and a thief, each with abilities that could be combined in creative ways to navigate the environment. It was visually stunning for its time and found an audience that appreciated both its art direction and its clever use of physics. It went on to spawn a series that's still going now.
It's on like five, trying five at this point. Beautiful games, so pretty. If you appreciate a good art direction, you'd appreciate the art direction of this for sure. It's gorgeous.
Well, hopefully they never stop trying to make a new game.
Oh, okay, good one.
And with that, Dave, we close this week on July 4th, 2012, when Phantasy Star Online 2 launched in Japan, developed and published by Sega. The original Phantasy Star Online had been a landmark in online console gaming back in 2000, and this sequel had been anticipated for years. When it finally arrived, it delivered an expansive online action RPG with deep character customization and a content model that kept players engaged across years of updates. Western players had to wait nearly a decade for an official release outside of Japan, but the game built a devoted international fan base long before that happened.
I don't know why. Um, I did Fantasy Star Online 2, or it will be on July 4th, my online This Day in Gaming History video. So if you're interested in that, check it out. But uh, I like watching video of it, watching gameplay of it. It is so a game I think that we would be into, and I don't know why we never got into that series. It just looks like the sci-fi art style and the action RPG and just everything about it. It looks like an Us game. You should look at it, Rob, and let me know.
We'll see, Dave. We will see on that. But with that, I think we're here to talk about something else. So why don't you take it away and give us the history on the Game Genie?
Well, I feel like my suggestion was just snubbed. And wouldn't you know it, the story of the Game Genie begins with a snub. Well, now we've talked about Codemasters before in our episode on Micro Machines, but since how they got their start directly ties to our topic today, we're going to revisit the issue. In the late 1980s, Codemasters was a British budget games developer founded by two brothers, David and Richard Darling. They had built a reputation selling games for home computers at prices that nobody else was willing to match. And by the time they started looking over here, across the pond, or so to speak, the NES had already had already taken over America. It was, as David Darling put it, everywhere. Even gas stations were selling Nintendo games at that point. So David Darling went to the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas to talk to Nintendo. They wanted to, make games for the NES. They wanted to be a part of the fun. He didn't get a meeting. Nintendo's representatives at the show weren't engaging with anyone who hadn't booked an appointment in advance. So Darling walked away empty handed. But he did not walk away discouraged. He walked away with a different idea entirely. If Nintendo wouldn't let Codemasters in through the front door, they would find their own way in. The company set about building an unauthorized development kit for the NES from scratch, which meant starting with something Nintendo had specifically designed to make that impossible. That would be their the 10 NES chip, right? That's a lockout chip. Every NES cartridge contained that lockout chip. And basically, it authenticated the cartridge before the console would run it, made sure it was a licensed, authentic Nintendo cartridge. Nintendo had purposely built the system to prevent exactly what Codemasters was attempting. So cracking it was frankly the only path forward. And so the person that they handed that problem to was Ted Karen. Karen built a makeshift development system that consisted of a PC connected to a Commodore 64, connected to a box full of wires and electronics, all hooked up to a consumer NES. So, can you imagine that?
I don't know, Dave. I don't think I could.
Computer into the Commodore into an NES. Just ribbon, ribbon, ribbon. Piggyback,
Yeah,
piggyback.
like thinking about that now, that's just it's wild.
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, it was the Wild Wild West, I guess.
But hey, you had to
You,
get it done.
you had to get it done. Needless to say, subsequent dev kits they came up with were more compact. That work was technically demanding, and it was deliberately undocumented, right? He has remained quiet about the specifics ever since, basically citing legal agreements that still hold even decades later. So we don't know much more about what Ted did there other than they had this fun little piggyback development system. What we do know is that it worked. Codemasters, using their GitHub, could now develop for the Nintendo without, Nintendo's permission. Their first application was porting Treasure Island Dizzy, one of their existing computer games, to the Nintendo Entertainment System. We have a Treasure Island Dizzy cartridge. In fact, we have more than one because I think they made just Treasure Island Dizzy, but they made these like 4-in-1 cartridges that I owned. It was the first time I had ever seen a multi cartridge, and mine was definitely a Codemasters one that included Treasure Island Dizzy. It was gold, if I remember correctly, and it had a little switch on it that you could switch. Did it have a switch on it, or was it in the menu multi game? I don't remember which
Yeah,
at the
you're
moment.
asking the wrong person, Dave. I don't know this thing at all.
With that being said, while they were working on porting Treasure Island Dizzy over, something else had caught their attention. And as part of the process, they had kind of engineered a knob on the cartridge that let players adjust the number of lives. It was basically so testers could just have as many lives as they needed to test the game out. It wasn't a big deal, it was a very small thing. The game didn't end up shipping with that knob, but it did point the team at Codemasters towards something, I guess, larger, right? The question that Codemasters started asking was, what if you could do something like that for every single game? And so Ted and the Darling brothers started meeting regularly at Richard Darling's flat in what David Darling would later describe as idea sessions. They held them every Wednesday. The goal was to think about what game concepts could appeal to absolutely everybody. And the answer that they kept circling back to wasn't a game at all. It was a device that worked on other people's games. If all the kids in America playing Super Mario Brothers, for instance, would love the ability to customize their Mario Brothers experience, you don't need to make a new game. You just need to make something that plugs into the games they already own and allows them to change the game. Now, the first prototype that they ever came up with was a box of wires and switches. It was crude, it was unglamorous, but it worked. Getting the device ready for release, as they figured out how to make it not look so awful, required one more step, and somebody had to go in and find what would eventually become the Game Genie codes, right? Because you have to have something for people to input to change the other games. So for every Nintendo game on the market, somebody had to go and work through the cartridge's memory addresses. They had to go through the game, right? Trial and error to discover what values could be changed and what those changes would do. And that's a really, like, when you stop and think about what that took, that's a monumentous, like, process, right? It it it, it took a lot. That job went largely to Graham Rigby, who became what Richard Applin later described as the main codemeister. It's a person who lived in a room containing every NES game in every territory, which sounds pretty cool if you think about it. I mean, he literally just had to sit in a room and play these games and figure out, what the codes were that changed the games.
Yeah, I mean that would be pretty damn cool, Dave. Not gonna
I,
lie.
th- I mean, I think it's like every damn game is a puzzle, right? Like, you go up to it and you got to find what memory values you can change, and then, like, it's probably very exciting when you finally find a memory value that you can change. I mean, it's like finding treasure.
Yeah, Dave. No, it genuinely is. It's something that I've done when I've been modding certain games.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, yeah.
So going through the source code and being like, oh, how do I change this value? How do I change this? And then like going in game and seeing it work, you're just like, oh fuck yeah, that's sick. So like yeah, 100% I agree. That'd be a badass job.
So working alongside him was Jonathan Menzies. He had written the ROM software for Codemaster's in-house development system, and he wired basically the dev kit for the Game Genie. It was a Commodore 64 that was wired to control a prototype Game Genie directly. So instead of having to enter it the way we entered it on a controller, they could enter the codes on a keyboard, and that sped up the process of finding the codes considerably. We all know the difference between, in the modern age of entering a password on a controller or a remote control versus a keyboard. It's night and day. The process was still slow. They could get three. It took them about 3 days per game, sometimes longer if it was a role playing game. Eventually, they found a way to daisy chain two Game Genies together, and that let them enter up to 6 codes at once. The plan was, when they released the device, they wanted to include a book, a guide of some kind that had the codes for about 255 games. Now, of course, the device needed a name. At first, it was called the Power Pack, But Codemasters were worried that players would mistake that for a battery pack, which now it is, right? So the name that stuck came from the structure of the interface itself, right? Came from the software. Players could enter up to 3 codes before starting a game. 3 codes, 3 wishes. Hence, Genie, Game Genie. Now, distribution of the device came through a connection that already existed. David Harding worked with them. He had been the Canadian distributor for Mastertronic. Mastertronic had distributed Codemaster games, and like to facilitate this process, David Harding set up his own company that was called Camerica, like literally C in America, Camerica. When Codemasters brought him the Game Genie, Harding recognized it as something that was bigger than what Camerica could handle by itself. So he took it to Louis Galoob Toys, a San Francisco toy company that was, depending on the year, among the 10 largest toy companies in the United States. When Louis Galoob's son first encountered the device, he became fascinated by its ability to make Mario jump higher. That was the demo he was given. So Galoob eventually agreed to distribute the Game Genie in North America. The Game Genie was announced in May of 1990. It was set to launch in July. But then Nintendo got wind of it. And Nintendo, of course, had other plans. Rob, hearing about all this reverse engineering, the PC connected to the Commodore 64, the box of wires, all this, spending 3 days on a single NES, it's complicated. And stories like this always make me genuinely grateful that starting a podcast doesn't require any of that.
Right. There's no logic analyzers, no daisy chain prototype cartridges, no room full of every NES game ever released in every territory.
Exactly. And that is largely because we use Zencaster, right? It's an all in one podcasting platform that takes the technical chaos out of the process entirely. You log in from your browser, you hit record, and you're instantly capturing studio quality audio and up to 4K video. There is no custom hardware, no box full of wires.
And what about when things go wrong mid recording? Because that's when things are going to go wrong.
Well, that's where Zencaster's multi layered backups come in. Even if your connection drops, your recordings stay safe and the highest quality. There is no lost work, no starting over.
And what about the editing? Please tell me it doesn't take 3 days per episode.
Not even close. Zencaster's post production tools automatically clean up background noise, trim filler words, and balance your audio. Help speed up the process a whole lot. The polish happens without the grind.
So once it's done, how do we get it out there?
Will Zencaster distribute your podcast directly to all the major platforms like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more, all from the same dashboard? In one place, you can record, refine, and release.
So basically, the opposite of building a cheat device from scratch in a flat in Warwickshire.
Yeah, pretty much. It's exactly the opposite. It is so easy. And if you're interested in an easy podcasting process, you can use Zencaster too. Go over to zencaster.com/pricing. Use our offer code, all one word, memory card lane. With it, you can get 30% off the first month of any Zencaster paid plan. If you've got a story to tell, Zencaster makes sure that the only thing you need to reverse engineer is your next topic.
No Commodore 64 required.
That's right. Head over to the Zencaster, use our offer code, all one word, memory card lane, and you can get 30% off your first month.
So Nintendo wasn't going to take this lying down, were they, Dave?
Absolutely not. Not at all. So Galoob knew that Nintendo was going to fight, right? The only question was how. On May 17th, 1990, rather than wait to find out, Galoob went first. The company filed a lawsuit against Nintendo in the United States District Court for the Northern District of California, seeking a declaratory judgment that the Game Genie did not violate any of Nintendo's copyrights. They also asked the court for something unusual, an injunction preventing Nintendo from ever modifying the NES to make it incompatible with the Game Genie. So basically, they said once we have the ability to mess with Nintendo's stuff, we never want them to be able to change it to mess up our product. That last request was seen as provocation, and Nintendo responded to it like it was provocation. So the company files its own complaint seeking to ban Game Genie sales entirely. Nintendo's argument was that the Game Genie created unauthorized derivative works. When a player used the device to alter a game's output, Nintendo argued, they were transforming a copyrighted work without permission. And Galoob was basically helping them to do it. Nintendo leaned on an earlier case involving a speed up kit for the arcade game Galaxian. We talked about that in our episode on Breakout. Go check that out if you want to learn about that whole legal case. So basically, that court, that case, the court had found that altering a copyrighted game's output constituted an infringing derivative work. On July 2nd, 1990, 46 days after Galoob filed, the court granted a preliminary injunction. Galoob had to stop selling the Game Genie in the United States while the case played out. In Canada, however, sales continued without interruption. Comerica ran advertisements and gaming magazines with a simple message: "Thank you, Canada." The ad showed the Genie figure and named the retailers carrying the device, followed by a line that made the situation plain as day. Nintendo had tried to stop them and had not succeeded, at least not yet, in Canadian courts. The injunction for them to stop, you know, producing the Game Genie here in the States held through an appeal in February of 1991. Back at Codemasters, the legal pressure was doing something unexpected. Rather than intimidating the team, it was galvanizing them, right? Graham Rigby later recalled that when the restraining order came down, the developers at Codemasters felt it was their field, their area of expertise, and that they had something to contribute. So they went to work. Jonathan Menzies, for instance, helped prepare for the lawsuit by creating non-Game Genie codes that could be entered into official Nintendo games' own password systems. And the codes that he was finding are passwords that would cause crashes, passwords that would cause graphical corruption, passwords that would cause other strange behavior. Precisely the things that Nintendo's lawsuit accused the Game Genie of doing. The whole point was to show a judge that these were simply features of how video games worked, not evidence of harm caused by the Game Genie. Smart, huh?
Yeah, definitely.
The trial took place in April of 1991. Nintendo called Shigeru Miyamoto, famous game developer, to testify in San Francisco. The company's argument had expanded beyond the derivative works question into something more philosophical, the concept of Nintendo culture, right? Nintendo argued that games were carefully designed systems and that allowing players to modify them would undermine the challenge that made the culture worth belonging to. Behavioral Modification psychologists testified that the Game Genie would make games less satisfying, reduce enthusiasm for Nintendo products, and potentially cause a collapse of the video game market similar to the crash of the early 1980s. Nintendo also ended up calling its own chief marketing officer as a witness. That did not go as planned. In documents presented at trial, Peter Main had previously told a 1989 Nintendo sales meeting that accessories gave players a whole new experience when they replayed software, and that this increased consumer satisfaction and brought them back for more. So he got into this meeting and basically said the opposite, right, of what's going on here. He had been talking about the NES Advantage, and the NES Advantage was a joystick that also let players slow down games and gain extra firepower. So Nintendo was arguing in court that the Game Genie would destroy the industry while simultaneously selling a device that did many of the same things you could do with the Game Genie.
Love that.
Love that for them.
Yep.
On July 12th, 1991, District Judge Fern Smith ruled in Galoob's favor. Her reasoning was straightforward. The Game Genie did not create a derivative work because it did not create anything permanent. When a player unplugged the device, the game returned to its original state. Nothing was stored, nothing was transferred. The altered display existed only in the moment of play, and once that moment ended, it was gone. A derivative work, Smith had concluded, had to exist in some fixed and separable form. The Game Genie produced no such thing. She was equally direct about what she thought Nintendo was actually trying to protect. The Copyright Act, she wrote, protects authorship, not market psychology. Having paid Nintendo a hard having paid Nintendo rather a fair return, the consumer may experiment with the product and create new variations of play for personal enjoyment without creating a derivative work. She compared this like the using the Game Genie to skipping portions of a book or fast forwarding a purchased tape. None of these practices permanently altered the original work. None produced something that could be transferred to someone else, and none deprived the copyright holder of the revenue that they were owed, right? So the injunction was dissolved and Galoob could ship. Of course, Nintendo appealed, and on May 21st, 1992, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals affirmed Smith's decision. Now, the appeals court added its own language about why the Game Genie was not infringing, right? The changes it produced were not fixed in any permanent form, and Nintendo had failed to show any economic harm from its use. Consumers had to buy Nintendo games in order to use the Game Genie at all. The device did not supplant demand for the original works, it depended on them. Nintendo then appealed the $15 million bond it had been required to post as security for this injunction, arguing that even if it lost the case, it shouldn't have to pay for sales that Galoob lost during the year or so that it couldn't sell the device. That's what the bond was for. They wanted to collect on all the lost sales. So this was their last ditch effort to not have to pay that money. On February 17th, 1994, the Ninth Circuit rejected that argument as well. The money went to Galoob, with a portion eventually reaching Codemasters. A BBC news report at the time stated that the Darling brothers had won more than £2 million from the computer giant from Nintendo.
Damn.
Richard Darling was quoted for a company like Nintendo to think that just because they're powerful and dominant, they can stifle good creative products. It's wrong. And he was glad that they didn't succeed. The This case ended up mattering beyond Galoob and ended up mattering beyond Galoob and Nintendo. Later in 1992, Sega versus Accolade came before the same Ninth Circuit. Accolade had reverse engineered the Sega Genesis to publish games without Sega's authorization. The court cited the Galoob case in ruling on Accolade's behalf. These two cases together helped establish reverse engineering as fair use, and they drew a clearer boundary around what copyright holders could and could not control once their products were in consumers' hands. The Galoob decision has been cited in legal decisions ever since. Decisions about modding, about emulation, about let's play videos, about just about anything that involves a person doing something unexpected with a game that they legally own. Codemasters were now very confident in the legality of their Game Genie device and excited about its commercial potential. And because of that, they turned to Sega next. Somewhere in all this mess, they had been developing a Sega Genesis version of the Game Genie. They did not ask Sega's permission. Codemasters, by this point, had built their own cartridge manufacturing facility on site and manufactured a small run of carts before going to Sega directly. That conversation was simple. They went to Sega and they said, "This is what we're going to do. Would you like us, would you like to sue us, go into court, or would you rather reach an agreement?" Sega took one look at everything and basically came to the conclusion that losing such a case could just open up the floodgates, for some ridiculousness, and so they chose the agreement. So the Sega Genesis Game Genie actually carried official approval upon its release. That device, the Game Genie, between the NES and the Genesis, ended up selling about 5 million units across all the platforms. We have a Game Genie somewhere. I remember.
I couldn't tell you on that. I remember Game Shark for sure, but I don't think I remember a genie.
Well, Game Shark would have been your PlayStation version.
I'm pretty sure Game Shark was on Nintendo 64.
That might perhaps be the case. Doesn't Game Shark work through the memory cards?
Cartridges.
Oh, nice. Yeah, we definitely had a Game Genie. I'm pretty sure we had a Game Genie. If we didn't have a Game Genie, someone had a Game Genie because I played around with the Game Genie a lot. I remember buying those books that would have all the different codes in it. That was because I was too young to understand memory addresses and how to modify them and stuff like that. So putting the codes in was literally the only way I was going to understand the situation. Anyway, there was a Game Genie 2 for the Super Nintendo that they designed that reached a fully working prototype. It included the ability for users to find their own codes. It had a slow motion mode. It had a battery backed memory that could save high scores. David Darling later called the fact that it never released one of Codemaster's biggest regrets. But by the time it was ready, the Galoob family had left the company. They were no longer doing business with, the family proper was no longer part of Galoob, and they were replaced by a bunch of executives who saw the Game Genie as a single toy rather than the foundation of a franchise. The product line and the Game Genie 2 with it was quietly retired. So there is one prototype out there. Richard Applin has it. And in a little footnote that says something about how business works in these situations, Codemasters and Galoob eventually ended up suing one another too. It happened. It was simply two companies with a lot of money at stake butting heads. The details of the course of the case remain private. The legal bills on top of everything else were considerable, according to parties involved. So but eventually they did resolve it and moved on. What the Game Genie left behind was not a product line, right? It was a precedent. The court had said something afterwards that had never been quite said before, but here it was, very clear as day. Players who have paid for a game have the right to alter their own experience of it. Their ownership included the freedom to experiment. It said that a copyright holder's authority over a work ends at the point of sale and does not extend into the living room. And that's a very different concept nowadays, right? Now that literally video games and the internet extend into the living room. But at the time, it was a novel concept, and some of the foundation still governs the way we look at this concept today. But back then, all it took was a $50 piece of plastic, a room full of NES cartridges, and the Darling brothers to establish this fact. If today's episode sent you deeper into the question of what players are allowed to do with the games they own, we have some ground already covered that connects directly to this story. Episode 141 goes back to where video game copyright law began, the early legal battles that first established whether games could even be protected and what that protection actually meant. The Galoob case didn't emerge from nowhere. It was built on a foundation that episode, 141, traces from the beginning. Episode 93 puts you inside another courtroom where Nintendo was the defendant, the Tetris rights battle that ran through the late 1980s and shaped who controlled what on the console that the Game Genie was built to work with. If you want to understand how aggressive Nintendo was about protecting its platform, that episode gives you a very clear picture. And if the Codemaster side of today's story caught your attention, the brothers who got that cold shoulder from Nintendo and decided to find their own way in, episode 280 tells another chapter of that same story. That's the same company, the same unlicensed NES dev kit, and a very different product. What came out of it was Micro Machines, one of the most inventive multiplayer games of the 90s. All of these episodes, of course, are found in our archive at www.memorycardlane.com. Rob, what else can listeners find when they head to the site?
You can find the calendar of our future episode topics, know what we'll be talking about in our upcoming weeks. You can also find some things we've recorded this year, like see the things Dave talked about, where you can go listen to those other episodes and know what we talked about in this year. You can find a link to our Discord where you can come chat with Dave and I and discuss video game topics or other related topics. And you can find links to our Patreon where you can help support us and get access to ad-free and unedited versions of our episodes. And you can find links to our social media, where I am on several platforms as Rob_O_Raptor, and Dave.
I can be found on various platforms as David is Wrong. Each week, we'll tell you one story relevant to the current week in game history. It can be about a game, a person, a technology, or console. We've even covered a few places as well. While telling you each story, we hope to teach you something new about the topic, what it took from the world as its inspiration, or what it gave back to the world in its legacy. When we sit down and research new topics each week, we get excited when we find out new things to share with you. It's a fantastic cycle of learning and teaching, teaching and learning, and in celebration of said cycle, we like to talk about our takeaways each week, what we learned. So, Rob, what did you learn today?
Well, I don't know that I ever remembered hearing about the Game Genie. It seems like something new. Obviously, I knew Game Shark growing up. That's what I was familiar with. I do think it's really cool that Graham Rigby got to just sit in a room and play games and figure out what code did what. It's a pretty cool job, in my opinion. Just play games and figure code out. A lot of fun. But it's mind-blowing to me that this all went to court and that they had the injunction that they couldn't sell the thing, but Canada was still like, nah, fucking sell it, eh?
Right? They
Like,
dude, literally, like the ad. If you go look at the ad, it's like a Comerica ad, and it's like a guy holding up the game, like a sign that just says "Thank you, America," like a big sign, and with the Game Genie, and it just says "Thank you, Canada," and it just on the bottom it says, it lays out Nintendo tried to stop sales of it, but didn't or something like that. Like it literally lays out the whole story. It's fun. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, so that's really cool to me. It's one of those things like all these legal proceedings going on. We hear about it every so often. Season Nintendo is involved in a lot of them, which I get. You're a big game company and you got to protect your things, but hey, winner for the consumer. Like the court said, we still have to buy the game to make the cheats work.
Absolutely, we're not buying games. It's not about that in any way, shape, or form.
So all in all, pretty cool. It's a story. Glad to hear how it turned out. Obviously, we like cheat codes. It's also crazy to me. I obviously having used Game Shark, I didn't think too much about this, but how some games have cheat codes built in, like Grand Theft Auto, for example, or the Konami code, and you don't need a separate piece of hardware to do that. So it's kind of the cool things like that to think about, like how this is so different from those things where it was intended versus, oh, people just made something that could change the actual game code and modify what it does. It's not something a developer included while they were creating the game.
No, not at all. Not at all. And I love that as part of the case, they went in there and they basically took Nintendo's password system and they turned it into a Game Genie in its own respect. They basically said, "Hey, we can do this without the Game Genie. We're not doing anything out of the ordinary. We're just, giving people a, I don't know, easier, different way to do something that's already part of video games." Like that's a fantastic argument.
No, absolutely it is. So they obviously had a really good lawyer and some really great ideas behind them. So awesome to hear. So those are my takeaways, Dave. What about yourself?
I am such a nerd for this stuff. It was, you guys got the summation of the court case, of course, because getting into the depths of it would take forever. But it was fun because I start out with Galoob, and then that just snowballs into all the other court, like a bunch of other court cases that cite it and how they cite it, and it was a lot of fun for me to kind of learn that this is where a lot of other situations that I'm privy to or have learned about started from. Like this is the lineage for a lot of legal cases that have come up in other topics, some of which we talked about, some of which we haven't, and so it was really interesting to dig into this actual court case and learn all about it because it's one of the earliest cases that deals with the player's ability to do what they want with a video game. What I didn't get into that I want to dig into more is how that may have changed as the technology changed and games went digital and so on and so forth. I have that on my to-do list now to go take a look at some more modern cases to see how those decisions are.
Sounds like a fun time to me.
It's a fun time. All right, Rob. Well, before I wrap it up and take it into next week, is there anything else you'd like to add to today's episode?
I'll just take a quick moment to say thank you so much to everyone for listening. It means the world to us to have you along, and we hope you enjoy learning the history of these games or the things that surround the games.
Yes, surround the games like the game cases.
The legal cases of the games. Hey,
Oh,
hey, there you go. Good job, Dave.
thanks. Ted Karen never wanted to talk about how he cracked Nintendo's lockout chip. Decades later, he still won't, not really, because the legal agreements in place outlived the lawsuits that demanded them. But the thing he built out of a box of wires did something that outlasted Codemasters, it outlasted Galoob, it outlasted the Game Genie itself. It helped answer a question that nobody had forced a court to answer before. When you buy a game, what do you actually own? Not the code, not the copyright, but the right to play it the way you want to play it in the privacy of your own home without anyone standing behind you with a contract. Judge Smith had put it more plainly than anyone before her had needed to. The Copyright Act protects authorship. It does not protect a company's feelings about how its games are supposed to be enjoyed. Nintendo ended up losing that case, and they kept losing it all the way through 1994. Because of that, things kind of fell apart. Codemasters never got the sequel they wanted. The Galoob family that believed in the product by then had moved on it, and even somewhere there's a Game Genie 2 prototype sitting in someone's house, the last evidence of a feature set that would never get to see the light of day. But what came of that is a legal precedent that stayed, right? It found its way into Sega versus Accolade. It found its way into modern cases when courts try to figure out what a player is allowed to do with a game that they paid for. And the reality is that it's all complex and legal, and frankly, the job of people a lot smarter than me to figure out how that all applies, and so on and so forth. But it all started because two brothers got a cold shoulder in Las Vegas and decided that that was a reason to start building something instead of walking away. Next week, we're leaving the courtroom and heading somewhere stranger. In 1996, Sega handed one of its most ambitious development teams a nearly impossible task: make something that justifies owning a Saturn. What Yuji Naka and Naoto Oshima built in response was a game about flying through dreams, scored like a symphony, controlled with a single analog stick that most players had never touched before. Nights into Dreams may not have ended up selling the Saturn, but it is one of the most imaginative things that Sega has ever made. So join us next week as we explore, the team, the hardware, and the dream that almost saved a console as we take next week's trip down memory card lane. Do the thing.
Ba ba dum ba ba ba